The Fates were three sister goddesses. Clotho wove a child's thread of life as it grew in the womb. Lachesis measured it out, determining the length of the child's days, and Atropos cut the thread, marking the day of the child's demise. There was no escaping what the Fates had determined. When the thread ran out, death had arrived. The idea of fate isn't just limited to the time of your death. Fatalism is a philosophical position that says that everything that happens is fated to happen. Nothing you do can change anything. But fatalism is just silly, right? I mean, now that we understand causation, we know that the future is affected by what we do today, and today we could choose to do different things. The gods don't determine our future, we do, right? Well, dismissing fatalism isn't quite so simple. And the belief in fate doesn't need to rely on gods or anything spooky. Some very reasonable presuppositions about the nature of truth, combined with some basic logical principles, seem to lead to the conclusion that what will be, no matter what. So if you want to avoid believing in fate, a very powerful ancient argument must be confronted first. One version of the argument for fate appears in Aristotle's On Interpretation that was written somewhere in the 4th century BC. Many other forms of this argument have appeared since then, and for this video I'm going to present my own version of the argument. So here goes. Suppose someone were to tell you that you will die drowning. If what that person said is true, then you will drown. And if what they said is false, then you won't drown. But what that person says must be either true or false, in which case you must already be fated to either drown or not to drown. And it doesn't even matter what that person says about the future or even whether or not they say it. Anything that could be said about your future must be either true or false, so it must already be determined what is going to happen. Now, this argument might not convince you, but it's quite hard to see what's wrong with it. So if we want to avoid the conclusion of fate, then we need to look at its assumptions and what happens if we reject them. First up, the argument assumes a correspondence notion of truth. This notion of truth says that if something is true and it describes the world as being a certain kind of way, then the world must be the way that that thing describes it as being. Similarly, if something that's said is false and it describes the world as being a certain way, then the world can't be the way that false thing describes it as being. Now, the argument uses this presupposition when it goes from saying that if what they say is true, then you will indeed drown, or if what they say is false, then you won't drown. But a correspondence notion of truth seems to be just pretty much what we mean by saying something is true or false. So it's probably not an assumption that we want to reject. Next up is the logical principle of bivalence. Bivalence says that anything that you say must be either true or false. So if it's not true that you will drown, then it must be false that you will drown. Now, bivalence is a standard principle of classical logic, but when Aristotle presents his argument, he then tries to overcome it by rejecting bivalence. So let's see what he thought. Aristotle thought that bivalence applied to statements about the past, or statements about the present, or statements about the future, as long as whether they would or wouldn't happen depended on the way things currently are. But Aristotle also thinks there are some claims about the future that the current world doesn't determine whether or not they will happen. A claim like "you will drown" is neither true nor false. It may become true if you do indeed drown, and it may become false if you die of some other means. And the kinds of things you do today might affect whether that claim becomes true or becomes false. Now, although Aristotle overcomes his own argument for fate by rejecting bivalence, most philosophers don't think this is a suitable response. For one thing, there are good technical reasons to hold on to bivalence as a logical principle. And these are things to do with the way truth is calculated in logic and certain proofs in logic and in mathematics that rely on bivalence. Now, these are a little bit complicated, so I won't go into them here, because there's a much simpler reason for rejecting Aristotle's solution as well. Suppose someone says to you that you will drown, and then a year later you do indeed drown. According to Aristotle, when they said it, it was neither true nor false, and it only became true when you did drown. But the person would seem to be totally correct if they said that, see, I told you you would drown, in which case what they said was true and not neither true nor false. The general problem with Aristotle's solution then is it means we can never say anything true or false about the future that doesn't ultimately depend on how the world already is. But it certainly seems as though we can. That's why we do things like make predictions or make bets. So let's see if there's a better way to overcome the argument for fate. Well, another assumption the argument makes is that if it is true that something is going to happen, then that thing is fated to happen and you can't do anything about it. But this assumption can be legitimately questioned. So let's have a think about it. The argument starts by having someone say, you will drown. The argument then says this is either true or false. We accept this so far because we accept bivalence. The argument then says that if it is true that you will drown, then you will indeed drown. And if it's false that you will drown, then you won't drown. We say yes to that as well because we accept a correspondence notion of truth. But this isn't fate yet. It only becomes fate if we also say that we can't do anything to change what's going to happen. And so far, it's not clear that we can't. Now, I admit that it seems we have a problem. If it is true now that you will drown, then that's it, you will drown. So it seems that whether a statement now is true or false determines what will happen. And there's nothing you can do about it because you can't turn a true statement into a false statement. And it's when we think about things in this way that the fatalism argument seems to go through, and it looks like we're left embracing fate. But this way of thinking can be avoided if we say that although the claim is true, it's not strictly speaking true now. It's just simply true or eternally true. So how does making truth an eternal matter change things? Well, first, it means that it cannot be causally related to the event it describes, because causation is a relationship that has to happen between things in time, between events. So it's not the truth of the claim that you will drown that causes you to drown. Instead, that drowning is caused by your actions and the circumstances. Say, the fact that you chose not to wear a life jacket and that the boat capsized. The relation that does exist between the true claim and the event of you drowning is a relation of dependence. And in this case, the dependence goes from the event of you drowning to the truth of the claim. If we were to explain things, we would say that the claim was true because you do indeed drown. And if you hadn't drowned, then the claim wouldn't have been true. So in this case, the eternal truth or falsity of the claim relies upon what, from our perspective, is an event in the future. To sum up this reply, I would say that whether or not you drown is not determined by fate or the truth of any claims, but is caused by your actions mixed with the circumstances. Even though the truth of the claim that you will drown is eternally true or false. Now, these positions are not inconsistent, and if you hold them, then you don't need to accept the fatalist conclusion of the argument. Now, if what I've just said sounds like fancy philosophical footwork, you could always just accept the argument and embrace fate. What will be, and we might as well get used to it. And who knows, maybe it doesn't really matter anyway, because as I argue in this very interesting video, the world isn't real anyway.